please come in and join us. All right, while you're doing that, I want to say good afternoon. Welcome. I am Kharis Templeman. I am the program manager for the Taiwan Democracy Project at the Center on Democracy Development and Rule of Law in the Freeman Spogli Institute. That's a lot. I want to welcome everybody to this Taiwan Democracy Project special event. Today we have the President of the Republic of China on Taiwan, Ying-jeou, speaking on US-Taiwan trade and economic relations. I'd first like to acknowledge, before we get into the substance, that our Taiwan Democracy Project has received and continues to receive generous support from the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in San Francisco. And we have several members of TECO here today with us. We want to welcome them especially. And I want to acknowledge Director General Bruce Fu, who has been the Director General since September 2012, and before that was posted in D.C., I believe, in Washington, D.C. And we'd like to thank him again for his office's generous, warm, and open-minded support of our project. Let me say a little bit about the project itself. The mission of the Taiwan Democracy Project is to foster the study, the discussion, and ultimately to foster a deeper understanding of how democracy works in Taiwan. And I expect we will have a lively discussion about that today in the Q&A. I will tell you now, we already have copies of the President's speech. And I will tell you now that much of the content of that speech is aimed at an American policymaking audience, so that it mostly focuses on Taiwan's relations with the United States. If you are interested in hearing more about, as I suspect many of you are, Taiwan's internal domestic politics of trade, I want to make a shameless plug for our next event in the project. May 5th at noon in this very room, we're going to have a speaker from Temple University, Rosalind Xue, who is a professor of political science there and also a visiting scholar this year at UC Berkeley. And as luck would have it, we arranged this before the events of the last month, but her talk is going to be exactly on this issue of domestic politics and trade in Taiwan. So we've had an extraordinary response to this event, and I would love to see many of you attend that event as well, because there will probably be more opportunity to engage with our speaker on the issue of trade politics in Taiwan. Okay? So again, that's May 5th, this room. At noon. And to resort to shameless bribery, we will also have free food there, and it's open to the public. So if nothing else, you will be well fed. So now let me say a word about the video that we're going to show. This is not a live speech. It was actually given 7 hours ago. Okay, 7 hours ago is 5 a.m. local time. And it was shown live on the East Coast at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And they had an opportunity then to engage with President Ma in some Q&A. We don't have that opportunity, and that's because of a trade-off. We could have shown this live at 5 a.m., but we didn't expect that we would get quite the response that we have gotten. And so rather than showing it live at 5 a.m., we all decided to get a good night's sleep and show it now. So I know some people in this room, at least, really needed a good night's sleep. So thanks for coming. Let me also, I forgot to mention this. Because we've had an extraordinary response, this event is being streamed live on the web, and we will also cache a copy of the event, a video copy, on our website. And so for people who were unable to attend for whatever reason, if you know some of them, encourage them to look at the video of both the speech and the Q&A in this room afterwards. And again, that will be available from our website. So now let me just say, here's how we're planning to proceed. The first thing is we're going to show the speech. It's about 20 minutes long. And then we're going to move to our panel discussants. We have Professor Larry Diamond and Dr. Thomas Fingar, and I will introduce them in more detail once we finish the speech. And then after the panel discussion, we will open it up to questions from the audience. And I should note that this is being streamed downstairs as well. We have an overflow room, and there's a person stationed down there who is able to take questions and relay those to me as well. So we want to try to include the overflow room as much as possible. Okay, without further ado, I will turn it over to our IT guy to start the, go ahead and start the speech. So let me introduce the other two panelists here. The first probably needs no introduction to many of you. Dr. Larry Diamond is a lifelong Stanford man, and among the many hats he wears is director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He is also the founding investigator of the Taiwan Democracy Project, and for present purposes, I should add he has a long relationship with Taiwan going back well beyond 2 decades. When were you first in Taiwan?
94.
94, yeah, so 2 decades. And so he was in Taiwan during many of the critical moments in Taiwan's transition to democracy. And so he's very knowledgeable about this subject as well. Our other panelist today is Thomas Fingar, who is the inaugural Oksenberg-Rohlen Distinguished Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute. He was the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford from January to December 2009. Before that, he served as the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently as Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He served previously as Assistant Secretary of the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Before that, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis from 94 to 2000. Director of the Offices of Analysis for East Asia and the Pacific before that, and Chief of the China Division in the 80s. Fingar is a graduate of Cornell University and holds an MA and a PhD from Stanford. And his most recent book is Reducing Uncertainty, Intelligence Analysis and National Security. Okay, so we're going to proceed starting with Dr. Fingar and then followed by Dr. Diamond.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming, and we all have to thank President Ma for his thoughtful remarks. I'd like to comment on 6 points, and I'll do this very briefly in the hope that it turns into a discussion with all of you. The first is to begin where President Ma did, the 35th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, a portion of which was actually drafted here. Victor Hao Lee, then in the Stanford Law School, was very actively engaged in that. I remember not just Victor, but all of us who were involved at the time being determined that the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, following the shift in recognition, not punish Taiwan, that the core purpose of the Taiwan Relations Act was to preserve, the phrase was every aspect of the relationship that existed except for the formal diplomatic representation in the capitals. It has proven remarkably successful in that regard. The second point relates to how different the region was, how different Taiwan was, how different the mainland was in 1979. Taiwan had not yet embarked on the transition to democracy. That President Lee marched through an abbreviated history of U.S. relations with the Republic of China, But these were not relationships between two democratic countries. It was still an authoritarian country that demonstrated remarkable economic success assisted by the United States. But there was a lot of inertia in the relationship, that we wanted to preserve the relationship because we didn't wish to penalize Taiwan. Taiwan wished to maintain the relationship that had existed. But I believe that a secondary objective of the U.S. in maintaining the relationship, maintaining engagement, were aspirations of transformation. That I think, and Larry is better qualified than I to comment, that the transition, the peaceful transition, the in many respects remarkably quick transition to electoral and liberal democracy in Taiwan, most of the credit undoubtedly goes to the people and the leaders on Taiwan. But the U.S. approach in this and the lessons that have been learned about it, I think, are important. We can talk about that at greater length. But there is kind of a model for the transition. One of the things, a few things that weren't mentioned in the introduction, is that 41 years ago I lived on Taiwan. I was a student at Taiwan. Lived under martial law. It was a very different place than it was 2 weeks ago when I was there again. The third point has to do with President's remarks about the East China Sea Peace Initiative. I think this is a terribly important approach, a development that requires more attention than it's received by folks on the mainland, folks elsewhere in the region. The principles of resolving disputes in accordance with international law, rule of law, and peacefully, and separating politically very difficult questions of sovereignty, territorial integrity, from practical requirements to cooperate in the exploitation of ocean resources, fish stocks on which so many people depend, whatever other resources are under the water, that the distinction between indivisible sovereignty and shared exploitation of resources, and doing this in a peaceful fashion is a terribly important way to think about so many of the issues that bedevil the region. Fourth point is cross-strait relations and cooperation. That I agree with President Ma that relations across the strait have never been better. Certainly never better in my lifetime, which is now going on 70 years. That's not an accident. I think there are many factors contributing to this. Wise leadership on both sides of the strait is surely at the top of the list. But the continued U.S. relationship with Taiwan, the nature of U.S. engagement with the mainland, taking those steps, including arms sales, that enhance the confidence of the people and political leaders on Taiwan to deal with the mainland, the strength of the U.S.-Beijing relationship to at least increase confidence in Beijing a little bit, that the U.S. believes in the one China principle we espouse and don't take issue with the position of either Taiwan or the mainland on that. But that the relationship has reduced tensions, it's created economic possibilities, it's increased the avenues for mutual understanding, and I think even more importantly, for Taiwan's experience to become a reference point for ordinary people and officials on Taiwan. I'm sorry, on the mainland. That back in 1979, there were discussions of whether or not Chinese culture was compatible with democracy. And running all the way back to Sun Yat-sen and Sheet of Sand, Taiwan has proven that it clearly is the case. And arguments against moving in that direction simply are not tenable. It's been good for democracy, the improvement across the straits. It's bolstered it on the island. It's been good for security and economics on both sides of the strait. Investment that is taking place because the region is more secure. And it's been very good for the United States. That lower tensions across the strait reduce the danger of the United States being drawn into a potential conflict situation or an actual conflict situation that we do not wish to have. The fifth, very briefly, economic integration of Taiwan into all kinds of formal organizations, informal arrangements, negotiations. The size of the economy, the importance of the industries, the importance of Taiwan in the regional and global production and supply chains, the lessons to be conveyed. Taiwan belongs in organizations of all kinds and should be included as early as possible in negotiations such as TPP. And finally, the big what next question. That there's no question in my mind but that President Ma deserves a great deal of credit for the improvement in cross-strait relations that has taken place, for the reduction in tensions, for coming up with creative ideas like the East China Sea Peace Initiative. But his term will end. And Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. What comes next is uncertain. Which party, which leaders will succeed is happily an open question, but that's the frustrating aspect about democracy, is its unpredictability in many respects. And I suspect, as a political scientist, that the outcome of the election will be determined more by domestic issues, domestic economic situation, than it will be by cross-strait and larger US-China and trade relationships. So we'll all have to hold our breath for a while. And therefore, my final remarks are on the what next. The February meeting between officials from both sides of the strait, the conclusion of agreements, the beginning of deeper institutionalization of the relationship. That I think it's very much in the interest of all parties concerned that as much be achieved in the time remaining in President Ma's term to institutionalize the cross-strait relationship, to provide a firmer foundation for this relationship than personalities. You're seeing that policy can't shift with electoral outcomes. They should in a democracy. But we don't want to, none of us should want to have at risk the much better arrangement that exists today. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Well, Tom, I think, has done a splendid job of elucidating these 6 insights and observations. and since there's none that I can disagree with, and I think they're very well and expertly stated, I'm going to pivot a bit using your sixth point as kind of a segue to the current situation. I feel there's a need, in part because of all the emails I've gotten in the last 2 weeks, to put President Ma's remarks and the current state of the US-Taiwan relationship and Taiwan's very justifiable ambition to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the context of what's happening in Taiwan today, in the sort of more generic sense, socially and economically, but also literally what's happening literally today or these days in Taiwan politically. So my few remarks here are frankly less upbeat than Tom's. I am very deeply worried about Taiwan. And those of you who are from Taiwan, I humbly suggest should be worried as well. I think it is entering a period of, frankly, existential difficulty. You can't have a group of young people or a group of disenchanted people, however idealistic they may be, seize control of the representative chambers of the democracy, barricade themselves within it, attempt forcibly to seize control of the executive offices of government, and think your democracy is doing well. And personally, I've said this to my friends in the DPP. I'm a very straightforward person. Most people who know me know this. I'll never be a diplomat because I'm just too darn candid. So I will just say this bluntly. If the civil rights movement in 1963, 4, 5 in the United States had somehow entered the premises of the United States Congress and taken control of the building, I can tell you as an American and a deep sympathizer of the civil rights movement, it would have set back the movement 20 years. The cost in public sympathy to such an act of disrespect to the institutions of democracy, at least in the United States, I don't know about Taiwan, would have been profound. Anyway, I say this by way of simply reflecting that those of us who had hoped that the rotation of power from Chen Shui-bian and the very confrontational period of his presidency to a president who, at least when he ran for office in 2008, tried to craft a campaign, a platform, and an image of national reconciliation and so on. Those of us who'd hoped that this might at least reduce political polarization in Taiwan and move democracy forward into a more boring period. Sometimes it's good for democracy to be boring. You don't always want it to be in crisis. I think those hopes have, not been realized in the last few years, and certainly not in the last few weeks. There's no one who can look at democracy in Taiwan today and not see a deeply, and I think worrisomely, polarized situation. Now, it is not unique to Taiwan. If you look at what's happening in the streets of Thailand now, it's frankly a heck of a lot worse. I'm just back from Turkey. It's pretty frightening there. And look at our own democracy in the United States is not exactly a love fest of bipartisan cooperation. But I think the events of recent weeks have moved it to a different level. So before I come back to that, let me tie this to what President Ma said today. And first note what I think may be two elements of relative bipartisan consensus in Taiwan. Because if we can find some elements of bipartisan consensus on in these sectors, inevitably, given the nature of international economic competition. So if Taiwan doesn't adapt its economic structure it's in trouble. Secondly, it's facing, as is Korea, as is Japan, some daunting challenges of an aging society with heavy burdens on health and pensions and so on, that, as we know in the United States, I'm not saying we're doing a lot better in this regard, but it's just not sustainable. The social bargain is going to have to be refashioned. I don't necessarily expect that this will be honestly confronted in the 2016 elections, even if you just predict from what's been happening in the U.S., but at some point it's going to have to be faced. And then there's just a lot of drivers, both in society and the media sector, as well as in party politics, of raw political polarization of the kind that that we're seeing here. I've mentioned the rise of China to, this increasing military behemoth and to great power status, which I think is just going to be continuing for a long time to come. So my concluding point is, which puts this in a kind of different context, I just think Taiwan cannot afford, it just simply cannot afford the crippling and poisonous level of political polarization that exists in the country today. The stuff I have seen on the internet, and even some of the messages I've gotten that are just, I won't even, it doesn't matter which party, which faction, whatever. It's just the content of utter contempt, intolerance, and distrust for, quote, the other side politically. I think Taiwan, that sometimes you're in your own bubble, and it can kind of be hard to stand outside of it and gain perspective. And so I think that it can be easy for political actors in Taiwan or anywhere to lose sight of, first of all, how important, as Tom said, Taiwan's democratic example is to the future of democracy on the mainland. And I've been actually a little surprised that the Chinese Communist Party hasn't exploited the crisis in Taiwan more aggressively to discredit, mobilization for democracy in China, although they're starting to do so in Hong Kong, which is a debate I'm following very carefully. And just, division against a mammoth existential division, absolute intolerant division at the level of what Taiwan has descended into, facing a kind of behemoth like the People's Republic of China. This is just not a very favorable context for dealing with all of these challenges of a policy and geopolitical nature that Taiwan is dealing with. So these are some of the challenges that I think Taiwan is going to have to face for the next, nearly 3 years, because yes, there'll be a new president of Taiwan, but he or she will not take office until what, March of 2016? May. Exactly 3 more years, and that's a long time to kind of creep along with the current state of politics.
Okay, so I have just some brief remarks. I'm going to try to keep this to just a couple of minutes so we can open it up to Q&A. I just want to pick up on one point that came up in Larry's comments, and that is, why is there so much polarization in Taiwan over what's effectively a trade issue? And I would say that it's wrong to characterize the cross-Strait trade agreement that's under consideration right now as solely a trade issue. It's really, it contains 3 pieces in the dispute. So there's fundamentally a political issue of whether closer economic integration with the People's Republic of China will be ultimately beneficial to Taiwan. It's certainly, I don't think there's any dispute that closer economic integration will change Taiwan's domestic political economy. And the question is whether it's worth it. And the second, though, is an economic question. Where would those benefits go? If there are benefits to be gained from closer integration, both what are the size of those benefits and how broadly will they be distributed? And so one of the things I've been most struck by in the events of the last month is actually the concern that there will be a fairly small slice of Taiwanese society that will benefit from these agreements and a much broader slice that will not. That attitude is a bit surprising because both Taiwan's distribution of wealth is quite equal relative to much of the rest of the world. And Taiwan has been a big beneficiary over the last 30, 40, 50 years of trade liberalization. Taiwan's economic development was based largely on that model. And so to see a kind of distrust of the current authorities in regards to this trade agreement, I think is concerning, and that issue also is wrapped up in the larger controversy. And then finally, I just emphasize there's a certain kind of institutional asymmetry in how Taiwan deals with its relations with the rest of the world versus the People's Republic of China. So to take two agreements that Ma Ying-jeou mentioned in his speech, Taiwan actually signed agreements with both New Zealand and Singapore in the last year. Those agreements went to the legislature. They were passed on an up or down vote, and Taiwan moved on. The cross-Strait Services and Trade Agreement there's actually a dispute about whether the hurdle should even be as high as those trade agreements. And so rather than facing a higher level of scrutiny, because this is such a big controversial issue, you might think from an institutional design perspective, it would make sense to have a higher level of scrutiny. There's actually potentially a lower level here. And so the spark that set off the student invasion of the legislature actually was over a procedural issue. And so ultimately, if Taiwan is able to grapple successfully with this larger existential question, it needs to deal both with the kind of economic issues of distributing the benefits from trade and this potential institutional issue, procedure dealing with any kind of relations across the strait. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and we will open it up to...
I'd suggest we take several.
Yeah,
and then
yeah. So we're going to take several questions, and I would, before I do this, I would like to emphasize we have only about 20 minutes left. So please make your questions as short and succinct and to the point as possible. Okay, and I will cut you off if we go more than a minute per question. Okay. I also have a couple questions reserved from the room downstairs, so I'll make sure to save some time for those as well. Okay, floor is open. Yeah, in the back corner.
So, as a graduate student at Stanford, I understand that democracy is what Americans are proud of. But as a Taiwan native, and also with many interactions with the top political leaders in mainland China, I'm actually confused which system is better. So first is the democratic system in Taiwan, but with a president who has influence over the KMT party, the majority party in Taiwan, as well as the administration Yuan, the legislator Yuan, and as well as the justice Yuan. So he basically controls a lot of the power over the government system. And the other system is actually the communism system in mainland China, with a very efficient government who has tolerance to almost all the free speech except for two: the independence of Taiwan and the independence of Xinjiang. So I'm actually love to hear perspectives from the panel speakers. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, right here.
I'm a business scholar from UC Berkeley. Currently, actually I'm working in Taiwan, Cheng-Kung University, Department of Political Science. I have one question, because I very much agree with both of you that Taiwan in current situation is very much in polarization. I think it's not only in the current kind of cross-strait economic event. Also, it happened in for the nuclear issue, the both nuclear power plant issue, and also for economic and environmental problem issues. There are a lot of complaints for this kind of polarization. So my question is that whether or not you have the solution for this kind of polarization. This is very important. And currently it was South Bay Salt Pan, San Francisco South Bay Salt Pan restoration project brought me here. And I study, actually I have one solution, but I'm not sure whether you think it's a good solution. Well, because the development of San Francisco Bay in 1960s, it's almost a down area, but it's amazing right now. It's a very clean environmental area, very, very great. I saw there's a mechanism, BCDC. Bay Conservancy and Development Commission. It is a very regulatory agency. So it's create this kind of history and story of Bay environment.
Okay.
This is my question for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take this young lady here.
I'm a graduate student in the history department here, and I wanted to ask the panelists to kind of speak more about what I think is a tension between improved cross-strait relations and improvements in Taiwanese democracy. You're saying that one leads to the other, and I think that's precisely what a lot of people in Taiwan would disagree about, because the PRC operates on the principle of absorbing Taiwan kind of by whatever means it deems necessary. So I'm not sure how that can result in the protection and the further development of Taiwan's democracy. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take 2 more questions. Don?
Yeah, I wonder if anybody would speculate on the kind of strategic considerations that might be rotating through the minds of people in Beijing. Would it be fair to say that China is gambling? I mean, I think that the treaty is likely to be adopted given the political strength of the KMT. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong about that. You know, unless the violence increases and we get, some sort of disaster scenario. So that China's has a window of opportunity in which they can be involved in the delivery of economic benefits to Taiwan that will be sufficiently generous and impressive to allow for the continuation of KMT rule, right, at the next election. So I guess there are 2 things. One, how realistic is that as a strategy? And second, and here's the key question, it's a kind of a micro question of the relationship between economy and politics and security. I mean, if, for example, the benefits of the trading agreement go disproportionately to an elite in Taiwan, given its relatively low Gini index, would that then frustrate Chinese ambitions? And then, if anybody wants to mention APEC, I would really appreciate it, because that is a target coming up this year. It will be in China. Taiwan, of course, is a part of APEC. And how do you think this might fit into a mainland strategy with regard to the island?
Okay, let's take 1 more. Yes.
From the past impression I have, looks like U.S. Government is going for the major power politics in the world, and recognize with China as the main power, Russia as the main power, and then try to dominate the entire world politics. I have a question. If U.S. is going to that way and totally ignore Taiwan's democracy.
Okay, great. Is it a quick?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
I just had a very brief question. A government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. And at the beginning of the President Ma, he said obviously everyone agreed he's Taiwan's president. But all over what he emphasizes is the Republic of China. Okay. And my question is that who are the people belongs to the KMT Ma's government? Okay. And then as you mentioned that for the polarization, for the peace agreement should be transparency, should be equality, and should be to the national benefit. But Ma's government in the due process last year he promised that would be examined and reviewed item by item, but he's not. His party, just a 30 seconds and hide in the restroom, and use the micro to announce it. What a joke!
Okay, we've got a nice diversity of questions here. I give all 3 of us a chance to respond.
The first question, which I would interpret as advantages or superior characteristics of a democratic system on Taiwan, which has problems that Larry identified at the moment, or authoritarian system able to get things done. I come down for democracy. that it's always messy, but it shouldn't be as polarized as it is now in Taiwan, now in the United States, now many places. In the case of Taiwan, it's easy to say, well, it's a sign of immaturity. It's a new democracy. And that the institutions of government, the rules, kind of run ahead of the civil society in learning how to interact with that. Unfortunately, we've been at it a lot longer and we have many of the same problems. So that facile answer is not the right one. But what I will point to out of the question is there is a disconnect or an incompatibility between sort of the effective institutions of government in Taiwan and the relationship of the body politic to those institutions and ability to work through them rather than around them. Let me take that. I want to build on what Larry said. I think mainland is watching this, watching the student demonstrations. And it's extremely worrisome. It's a cautionary tale. They're afraid of any kind of demonstrations, especially students, especially in the capital. And here, I think it will cause attitudes in the leadership in Beijing to harden against making the kind of changes that move towards democracy. So it may make sense in the politics on Taiwan. It's counterproductive in terms of influence on the mainland. On the polarization aspect, it was my impression a couple weeks ago, I was there when the occupation started, that this is a manifestation or a reflection of deep divisions in the body politic that found expression around this issue, rather than this issue causing polarization. And that needs work, and it needs work way before the election to try and find that common ground, and I'll stop with that. Tension between cross-straits and democracy development, and so is there a trade-off here? And what might be done by the government, any government, happens to be KMT Ying-jeou right now, to stabilize, improve, reap the advantages, minimize the downsides of dealing with the big guy across the strait, and furthering, nurturing Taiwan and democracy. I think one could sketch out a model, a theoretical approach in which there are trade-offs and costs and benefits to be, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. And part of it has to do with other points being made about the who benefits, and how widely are the benefits distributed, and how much of a sense of involvement, engagement, of controlling destiny, one's own destiny, that's at the heart of democracy, may get at the polarization. But I think it needs work rather than simply assuming these are bad trade-offs or essential trade-offs and we have to live with them. You don't have to live with them. Can China influence or attempt to influence the election? I'm going to dodge some questions here. I think they've learned that there's not much they can do, in part because of the incredibly ham-handed way, and going all the way back to firing the missiles, because they didn't want Li Donghui to be elected. That a recognition that they don't understand it well enough. And there is a little bit of a, where's this coming from? The suspicion of mainland motivations, that if they came with a great big bag of money or birthday cake or whatever, the suspicion is going to be enormous. And I think they realized that on there. That finally, on the big power politics, I guess I made myself less clear than I had hoped initially. The U.S. will play big power politics. We're a big power. And if you don't worry about the big guys, you can't take care of the smaller guys. But the whole point of maintaining the relationship through the Taiwan Relations Act and all of the ancillary was, we're not walking away. This isn't either or. This isn't a pivot away. That if you don't pay attention to your friends of whatever size, you're not performing as necessary to exercise leadership on the world stage. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Since Tom gave so many, I think, really lucid and insightful answers, I don't feel the need to respond to everything here. Let me be very selective. First of all, on polarization, let me just say, because there's so, as in the United States and as in some other places, there's so many contributing factors that, you know, you'd need a whole conference, which we're hoping to have soon, to address the issue. But let me mention two causal factors, neither of which is going to be very easy to fix. And Americans are both of them are prominent in the mix of our own deepening political polarization in the United States. First of all, there has been in Taiwan, in Korea, in the United States, in some other democracies, a profound transformation of the media environment. And it's worse in Taiwan than it is in the United States. We have one Fox News and one MSNBC. I think Taiwan has about 6 or 7 of them. And if it's, you know, all political pummeling all the time, 24 hours a day, with hired talking heads who have no, forget about which side, just who have no respect or appreciation for the other side, and there's kind of no common arena, common sphere of dialogue and mutual respectful, you know, engagement, it tends to, you know, aggravate the situation at least. And this is why CNN, until the Malaysian plane disappearance, has been third place behind Fox News and MSNBC. Then the second thing is, I think Taiwan, and most political scientists inside Taiwan, and those I know who study Taiwan from outside Taiwan, think Taiwan stuck itself with extremely unfortunate institutional arrangements that got worse rather than better in the last round of constitutional revision. Although the single non-transferable vote electoral system was such a disaster, almost anything would have been an improvement. But what happened was totally predictable. Taiwan adopted a highly majoritarian electoral system in which the vast majority of the seats are single-member district, winner-take-all seats. Why the DPP agreed to this, I still can't figure it out, because it was utterly predictable that it was not going to be to their advantage initially. And the KMT won most of the seats. Surprise, surprise. Political scientists were predicting this was going to happen. And so you've got a situation where the DPP is underrepresented in parliament relative to its kind of natural base of support in society. And there's an excessively large majority, and a lot of DPP legislators, frankly, have resorted to pretty dramatic obstructionist tactics, which, to be fair, I think helped to drive the KMT to use the extraordinary measures it did with respect to this piece of legislation. I do not mean to justify it or at the moment necessarily criticize it otherwise. I'm just making an observation. I think this is a really bad electoral system, and I think it was a really bad idea to reduce the size of the legislature to such a small level as well. And now Taiwan is stuck with very suboptimal political institutions that contribute to political polarization and reduce, just in the size of the legislature, the maneuvering room for alternative political voices and more fluid coalitions. And it's really hard to amend this constitution. My advice would be to Taiwan to go back to the size of the legislature it had initially, which I think was 165 members, restore all of the additional increase in seats to party list seats, or else look to the ranked choice voting that's being used in Oakland now to choose the mayor, which tends to induce moderation. Indeed, What I think would help a lot in the polarization would be to increase the legislature to 165 seats, make half of the seats elected, more or less half, by party list, and the other half of the seats, more or less the existing single-member districts, convert them, rather than winner take all, or rather first past the post, convert them to ranked choice voting, where there's an inducement, as we see with the election of the parliament in Australia for the last, 100 years or so, 60 or 70 at least, toward moderation. Because if you're too strident and you don't get enough second and third preference votes, you won't win, even if you have a strong base. It's exact opposite logic of the old single non-transferable vote system. So that's my thoughts on a couple of the drivers of political polarization. And I agree with Tom. I think you've really got the United States wrong here. First of all, we're facing the prospect of I can't even believe I'm saying this 20 years after the end of the Cold War, but we're facing the prospect of conceivably even military confrontation between Russia and China, between Russia and the United States. I realize somebody's going to go out and tweet this, and I'm going to be accused of being a nut. But let me tell you, first of all, I think there's a 50-50 chance that Russia's going to invade eastern Ukraine in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And if it does, and it swallows up eastern Ukraine, you think Putin's going to stop there? I don't either. So we agree. And boy, if I were Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, I'd be pretty nervous. And the United States of America cannot allow a NATO country to be conquered by Russia. We just can't allow it to happen. And you look at what's going on in so many theaters of tension now between Russia and the United States. To say that we're just agreeing to a big power concert, or that we're standing blithely by while China, has its sights on either of these groups of islands, either what many of you call the Diaoyu Thai Islands or the Spratly Islands, it just doesn't accord with reality in my view. And I think you cannot underestimate how strongly people in the United States identify with Taiwan because it is a democracy, which is why I'm worried about the state of democracy in Taiwan. It's a national security issue for Taiwan. So I think that's enough.
Well, we let that sink in. We're going to go a little long, so we have about 10 more minutes. We're going to extend this to 1:40. So I have a couple questions from downstairs, and then I also want to take a couple more from the audience here. But let me first read the two questions I have. So the first one is, and this is probably more directed towards Tom, in a recent Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Marco Rubio asked an administration official about the 6 assurances given by the Carter, I think that should be Reagan administration. What do you think is President Obama's reasoning for not instructing the State Department to be as committed to these 6 assurances as before? So what do you make of the State Department's response to that question from Rubio? And then the second question is drawing a comparison with the United States. Recent polls indicate that 90% of Americans want some kind of background checks when purchasing firearms, yet there's no such action in Congress. So sometimes the nation's legislature does not act for the will of the people. Without such background checks, mentally unsound persons will acquire firearms, the effect which may be more shootings. So in Taiwan's case, the effect may be of less economic control. Should the protesting students let the trade agreement go, like Americans who are now resigned to a dysfunctional Congress? Okay, so we've got those two questions, and then let's take about 2 more. So, yeah. Yep.
James Chung. Let me introduce myself, the director of the KMT parties of the overseas operation. All right. First of all, appreciate the Institute to give this such an opportunity. that all the overseas concerned the Taiwanese current situations have an opportunity to discuss about this. And I say here, I hear all the different opinions, but KMT did everything possible, okay, to deal with this student situation, and especially Mr. Shea remind that for that 30 seconds things. But before that, we do have about I cannot count how many times, 10 times public hearing, and also many discussion and publication. So it's not just like that. Has been go through every stage. Okay, that's number one. And number two, I really appreciate Professor Diamond. You called, you are really worried. I never heard. I heard many times you are talking about Taiwan, but this is the first time I heard you say you're really worried now.
Yeah, it's the first time I felt.
Okay, so it is, because the Democrat, you cannot abuse like this. Okay, without the law, the Democrat can be collapse. Okay, so I hope this is the only times we can let these things just go so far. Okay, not to go beyond. Let me finish.
Make a comment or make a question.
Yeah.
I think it is time for a question, not
Okay.
for a comment.
All right. That's okay. Part of it is my question too.
I have a lot of comment too.
So my question now. Okay. My question now is, after this so-called student whatever whatever the activity. Okay. United States have any thought, and you worry, but you have any suggestion? Okay, how the government or the parties will deal with this situation in the near future?
Okay, great. So we've got 4 questions before the panelists. Do you want to go first?
Larry, go first, then I'll take.
Okay, just very briefly, because we're almost out of time, I'll let Tom take the question about the 6 assurances. Let me say on the question of should people in Taiwan and the students of Taiwan just kind of suck it up and swallow the fact that the KMT has a legislative majority and can do whatever it wants. I believe strongly in the principle of nonviolent civil disobedience. I personally, I think that seizing the very public buildings in which democracy operates is a bridge too far, but I can't criticize students or anyone for peaceful protest, that is within the spirit of the rule of law anyway. And if they had gathered in a public square or something, I would have been entirely sympathetic, at least with their right to do so. And I'll just say, this really answers your question as well as this question that was asked. First of all, the U.S. can't have a position on this. First of all, we're not doing so well ourselves in fashioning legislative consensus. So to tell the parties in Taiwan how they should deal with one another to fashion democratic governability would just be the height of national arrogance on our part. As a political scientist, I don't feel restrained in offering some insights about some of the social and institutional drivers here that might be addressed. But on the current situation, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, picking up on what Kharis said in the first round of our reactions, I think this is not only an existential moment for Taiwan, but this trade and services agreement, it's a pretty important piece of legislation. It's more important than NAFTA was in the United States, and that was a very polarizing issue that was subjected to months of national debate. And so I just don't think it's a good idea, even though I'm sympathetic to it, and even though I think in principle something like this has to happen. Taiwan just isn't going to get into the TPP if it doesn't move along this front with mainland China in some way. And if it doesn't get into the TPP and this isn't moving forward, you know, the momentum for bilateral trade liberalization agreements is going to dry up, and Taiwan is just going to sink further and further behind in economic competition. But in the end, and I do think NAFTA was a defining moment in the United States in terms of establishing this principle. In a democracy, if something is really important, you just have to bring the people along. And you know, there's got to be an open debate where you thrash it out and try and arrive at a national consensus. And that would be my point, not only about this kind of broad path of trade liberalization, not only with the mainland, but more broadly, but also I think that it would be possible, really, if they could sit down out of the limelight and out of the heat of all these talking heads on cable television. What are they called? The big mouths or smart mouths, or what's the Chinese term?
抿嘴.
Huh?
抿嘴.
Yes. So if you could kind of meet in a room without them there, I think maybe the two parties might be able to agree on some basic principles of consensus with regard to cross-strait relations going forward. And that could be very reassuring to the mainland and very healthy for politics in Taiwan.
Yeah, very briefly on the question about the 6 assurances and Danny Russell's testimony. Having testified many times with some appreciation for the dynamics, my understanding of this is that Senator Rubio kind of asked this question repeatedly. I mean, he kept coming back to it, and Danny kept answering it. And each time he answered, it was a more abbreviated, which apparently was they're walking away from the 6 issues, because he didn't recite all 6 of them. The State Department, again, my understanding, issued a clarification in Danny Russell's name after it that the 6 assurances remain in place. There is no change under the Obama administration. And that was what Russell was trying to convey, and if that didn't come across clearly, he apologized for it. That I just want to close by underscoring one of the points that Larry just made about the importance of the public debate, of public education, of bringing the public along. That I do not pretend to understand all of the intricacies of legislative procedure in Taiwan. But while I was there, I heard several times the explanation of, we don't need to do this. We don't need to debate all of these points because the procedures don't require it. Well, process matters. And whether it was technically required or not, it should have taken a very short period of time before somebody said, we got to do this anyway. Because the failure to do it will engender suspicion that there are things there that are more injurious or potentially injurious to the interests of the people on Taiwan than the negotiators believe to be the case. Without public understanding, you really can't succeed.
And on that note, we will bring our formal discussion to a close. Thank you all for attending. Again, this will be up on the web. Let's give everybody a round.